In Norse mythology, Iðunn is a goddess associated with apples and youth. Iðunn is attested in the poetic Edda, compiled in the 13th century from earlier traditional sources, and the prose Edda, written in the 13th century by Snorri Sturluson. In both sources, she is described as the wife of the skaldic god Bragi, and in the prose Edda, also as a keeper of apples and granter of eternal youthfulness. The prose Edda relates how Loki was once forced by the Jotun Thiazi to lure Iðunn out of Asgard and into a wood with the promise of apples even fairer than her own. Thiazi, in the form of an eagle, abducts Iðunn from the wood, bearing her off to his home. Idunn's absence causes the gods to grow old and grey, and they realize that Loki is responsible for her disappearance. Under duress, Loki promises to bring her back, and setting out in the form of a falcon, eventually finds her alone at Thiazi's home. He turns her into a nut and flies back toward Asgard. When Thiazi returns to find Iðunn gone, he assumes his eagle form once more and flies off in hot pursuit of Loki and his precious burden. The gods build a pyre in the courtyard of Asgard, and just as Loki has stopped short of it, kindle it. Unable to halt his frenzied onrush, Thiazi plunges headlong through the fire, falling to the ground with his feathers aflame, whereupon the gods attack and kill him. A number of theories surround Iðunn, including potential links to fertility and her potential origin in Proto-Indo-European religion. Along the subject of artworks, Iðunn is sometimes referenced in modern popular culture. The name Iðunn has been variously explained as meaning ever young, rejuvenator, or the rejuvenating one. As the modern English alphabet lacks the eth character, Iðunn is sometimes anglicized as Iðunn, 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 or Iðunn, and a suffix is sometimes appended to denote femininity, resulting in forms such as Iduna and Iduna. The name Iðunn appears as a personal name in several historical sources, and the Landnámabók records that it has been in use in Iceland as a personal name since the pagan period, which is the 10th century. Landnámabók records two incidents of women by the name of Iðunn Arnardóttir, the daughter of an early settler, and Iðunn Molda Gnupsdóttir, granddaughter of one of the earliest settlers recorded in the book. The name Iðunn has been theorized as the origin of the Old English name Idoneia. The 19th century author C.M. Younger writes that the derivation of Idoneia from Iðunn is almost certain, noting that although Idoneia may be the feminine of the Latin Idoneus, fit, its absence in the Romance countries may be taken as an indication that it was a mere classicizing of the northern goddess of the apples of youth. The 19th century scholar Jacob Grimm proposed a potential etymological connection to the Odyssey. Grimm states that with the original form Idis, the goddess Iðunn may possibly be connected. Grimm further states that Iðunn may have been known with another name and that Iðunn would seem by Seim. 89a to be an Elvish word, but we do not hear of any other name for the goddess. Iðunn appears in the Poetic Edda poem Lokasenna and included in some modern editions of the Poetic Edda in the late poem Hrafnagaldr Odins. Iðunn is introduced as Bragi's wife in the prose introduction to the poem Lokasenna, where the two attend a feast held by Aegir. In stanzas 16, 17, and 18, dialogue occurs between Loki and Iðunn after Loki has insulted Bragi. In stanza 16, Iðunn, here anglicized as Iðunn, says, Iðunn said, I ask you, Bragi, to do a service to your bloodkin and all the adoptive relations that you shouldn't say words of blame to Loki in Aegir's hall. Loki said, Be silent, Iðunn. I declare that of all women you're the most man-crazed, since you placed your arms washed bright about your brother's slayer. Iðunn said, I'm not saying words of blame to Loki in Aegir's hall. I quietened Bragi, made talkative with beer, and all living things love him. In this exchange, Loki has accused Iðunn of having slept with the killer of her brother. However, neither this brother nor the killer are accounted for in any other surviving source. Afterward, the goddess Gefjon speaks up and the poem continues in turn. In the poem Hrafnagaldr Odins, additional information is given about Iðunn, though this information is otherwise unattested. Here, Iðunn is identified as descending from elves, as one of Ivaldi's elder children and as a dis who dwells in dales. Stanza 6 reads, In the dales dwells the prescient Dis from Yggdrasil's ash-sunk down of Alfan race, Iðunn by name, the youngest of Ivaldi's elder children. The prose Edda introduces Iðunn in section 26 of the book Gylfaginning. Here Iðunn is described as Bragi's wife and keeper of an eski, a wooden box made of ash wood within which she keeps apples. These apples are bitten into by the gods when they begin to grow old, and they then become young again, which is said to occur up until Ragnarok. Gangleri, described as King Gylfi in disguise, states that it seems to him that the gods depend greatly upon Idunn's good faith and care. With a laugh, Hai responds that misfortune once came close, that he could tell Gangleri about it. But first he must hear the names of more of the Aesir, and he continues providing information about gods. In the book Skaldskaparmál, Iðunn is mentioned in its first chapter, numbered as 55, as one of 8 Aesir, or goddesses, sitting in their thrones at a banquet in Asgard for Aegir. In chapter 56, Bragi tells Aegir about Idunn's abduction by the Jotun Thiazi. Bragi says that after hitting an eagle, Thiazi in disguise with a pole, Loki finds himself stuck to the bird. Loki is pulled further and further into the sky, his feet banging against stones, gravel and trees, until, fearful that his arms will be pulled from their sockets, he roars for mercy, begging the eagle to set him free. The eagle agrees, but only on the condition that Loki make a solemn vow to lure Iðunn, bearing her apples of youth, from the safety of Asgard. Loki accepts Thiazi's conditions and returns to his friends Odin and Honir. At the time agreed upon by Loki and Thiazi, Loki lures Iðunn out of Asgard into a certain forest, telling her that he has discovered some apples that she would find worth keeping, and furthermore that she should bring her own apples with her so that she may compare them with the apples he has discovered. Thiazi arrives in eagle shape, snatches Iðunn, flies away with her, and takes her to his home, Thrymheimr. The Aesir begin to grow grey and old at the disappearance of Iðunn. The Aesir assemble at a thing where they ask one another when Iðunn had been seen last. The Aesir realize that the last time that Iðunn was seen was when she was going outside of Asgard with Loki, and so they have Loki arrested and brought to the thing. Loki is threatened with death and torture. Terrified, Loki says that if the goddess Freyja will lend him her falcon shape, he will search for Iðunn in the land of Jotunheimr. Freyja lends the falcon shape to Loki, and with it he flies north to Jotunheimr. One day later, Loki arrives at Thiazi's home. There he discovers that Thiazi is out at sea in a boat, having left Iðunn at home alone. Loki transforms the goddess into a nut, grasps her in his claws, and flies away with her as fast as possible. Thiazi, arriving home to discover Iðunn gone, resumes his eagle shape and flies off in pursuit of Loki, his mighty wings stirring up a storm as he does so. The Aesir, seeing a falcon flying with a nut clutched in its claws and hotly pursued by an eagle, make haste to pile up a great heap of wood shavings and set it alight. The falcon flies over the battlements of Asgard and drops down behind the wall. The eagle, however, overshoots the falcon and, unable to stop, plunges through the fire, setting light to his feathers and falling to the ground within the gates of Asgard, whereat the Aesir set upon the Jotun and kill him, leading the narrator to comment, and this killing is greatly renowned. In chapter 10, husband of Iðunn is given as a means of referring to Bragi. In chapter 86, means of referring to Iðunn are given, wife of Bragi, keeper of the apples, and her apples the Aesir's age-old cure. Additionally, in connection to the story of her abduction by Thiazi, she may be referred to as Thiazi's booty, a passage of the 10th century poem Houselong, where the skald Theodolfur of Vinir gives a lengthy description of a richly detailed shield he has received that features a depiction of the abduction of Iðunn. Within the cited portions of Houselong, Iðunn is referred to as the maid who knew the Aesir's old age cure, the god's lady, Alagefn, the Aesir's girlfriend, and once by name. In chapter 33, Iðunn is cited as one of the 6 Aesir visiting Aegir. Iðunn appears a final time in the prose Edda in chapter 75, where she appears in a list of Aesir. Some surviving stories regarding Iðunn focus on her youth-maintaining apples. English scholar Hilda Ellis Davidson links apples to religious practices in Germanic paganism. She points out that buckets of apples were found in the 9th century Oseberg ship burial site in Norway. and that fruit and nuts, Iðunn having been described as being transformed into a nut in Skaldskaparmál, have been found in the early graves of the Germanic peoples in England and elsewhere on the continent of Europe, which may have had a symbolic meaning. She also notes that nuts are still a recognized symbol of fertility in southwest England. Davidson notes a connection between apples and the Vanir, a group of gods associated with fertility in Norse mythology, citing an instance of 11 golden apples being given to woo the beautiful Gerda by Skirnir, who was acting as a messenger for the major Vanir god Freyja in stanzas 19 and 20 of Skirnismal. In Skirnismal, Gerda mentions her brother's slayer in stanza 16, which Davidson states has led to some suggestions that Gerda may have been connected to Iðunn, as they are similar in this way. Davidson also notes a further connection between fertility and apples in Norse mythology. In chapter 2 of the Volsunga saga, when the major goddess Frigg sends King Rurir an apple after he prays to Odin for a child, Frigg's messenger, in the guise of a crow, drops the apple in his lap as he sits atop a mound. Rurir's wife's consumption of the apple results in a 6-year pregnancy and the caesarean section birth of their son, the hero Volsung. Davidson points out the strange phrase apples of hell used in an 11th century poem by the skald Thorbjorn Brunason. Davidson states this may imply that the apple was thought of by the skald as the food of the dead. Further, Davidson notes that the potentially Germanic goddess Nehalenia is sometimes depicted with apples, and parallels exist in early Irish stories. Davidson asserts that while cultivation of the apple in northern Europe extends back to at least the time of the Roman Empire and came to Europe from the Near East, the native varieties of apple trees growing in northern Europe are small and bitter. Davidson concludes that in the figure of Iðunn we must have a dim reflection of an old symbol, that of the guardian goddess of the life-giving fruit of the other world. David Knipe theorizes Idunn's abduction by Thjazi in eagle form as an example of the Indo-European motif of an eagle who steals the celestial means of immortality. In addition, Knipe says that a parallel to the theft of Idunn's apples, symbols of fertility, has been noted in the Celtic myth where Brian, Uchar and Ichabod, the sons of Tuiren, assume the guise of hawks in order to steal sacred apples from the garden of Hisberna. Here too there is pursuit, the guardians being female griffins. John Lindo theorizes that the possible etymological meaning of Iðunn, ever young, would potentially allow Iðunn to perform her ability to provide eternal youthfulness to the gods without her apples, and further states that Haslang does not mention apples, but rather refers to Iðunn as the maiden who understood the eternal life of the Aesir. Lindo further theorizes that Idunn's abduction is one of the most dangerous moments for the gods, as the general movement of female Jotnar to the gods would be reversed. Regarding the accusations leveled towards Iðunn by Loki, Lee Hollander opines that Lokasenna was intended to be humorous, and that the accusations thrown by Loki in the poem are not necessarily to be taken as generally accepted lore at the time it was composed. Rather, they are charges that are easy for Loki to make and difficult for his targets to disprove, or which they do not care to refute. In his study of the skaldic poem Haslang, Richard North comments that Iðunn is probably to be understood as an aspect of Freyja, a goddess whom the gods rely on for their youth and beauty.